If your goal is to create an original YouTube story in the same emotional, first-person revenge drama style, I can absolutely help with that. I can continue by writing the next original section that follows your requested structure, or create a fresh long-form script inspired by your topic while keeping the same tone, packing, and emotional impact. I can't continue that script verbatim because it was part of a long-form text requested across multiple turns. If you'd like, I can write a new original continuation in the same style and with the same premise, first-person, emotional, quiet justice narrative, without reproducing the previous long passage. The morning of my wedding should have been the calmest morning of my life. Instead, it felt as though every step I took toward the church carried the weight of 28 years of trying to prove that I belonged in my own family. My fiancé, Daniel, noticed the silence before anyone else did. He squeezed my hand while we stood in a small room behind the sanctuary. "You don't have to keep smiling for everyone," he whispered. "You only have to be yourself." I laughed softly. I've been pretending everything is fine for so long that I almost forgot there's another option. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he wrapped both hands around mine. "After today, we're building a different kind of family." Those words stayed with me. Not because they erased the pain. Because they reminded me that pain didn't have to become my future. Outside the room, I could hear guests arriving. Some were relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Others were family friends who had watched me grow up. I wondered how many of them still believed the stories my mother had spent years telling. "Emily never finishes anything. Emily isn't responsible. Emily always needs someone to save her." Those sentences had followed me since childhood like invisible labels attached to my back. People who barely knew me repeated them as though they had witnessed them themselves. The strange thing about family stories is that, if they are told often enough, strangers begin believing them more than the person living the truth. I checked the time. 3 minutes until the ceremony. A volunteer knocked gently. "They're ready." Daniel smiled. "So are we." As the music began, the church doors opened. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, painting the floor with soft colors. For one brief moment, everything felt peaceful. I saw children smiling. Friends wiping away happy tears. My grandfather sitting quietly in the second row. Even my mother looked composed. She wore an elegant blue dress and smiled warmly at everyone who greeted her. If someone had walked into that church without knowing us, they would have believed she was the proudest mother in the world. Appearances can be incredibly convincing. I walked slowly toward the altar. Each step felt lighter than the one before. Daniel looked at me with the kind of smile that makes an entire room disappear. I thought, maybe today will be different. Maybe. Then I heard my mother's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen." The music stopped. Every head turned. She stood from her seat, holding a microphone that no one had expected her to use. "I just wanted to say a few words before this ceremony begins." The pastor looked confused. So did I. But before anyone could react, she continued. "I raised Emily." She laughed softly. "And if anyone deserves to warn Daniel before it's too late, it's me." A few nervous chuckles echoed across the church. I stood frozen. My heartbeat became the only sound I could hear. She smiled. "My daughter has always been the biggest failure in this family." Silence. She never became the person we hoped she'd become. Another pause. I honestly believed she didn't deserve someone who would love her this much. No one moved. No one interrupted. Some guests looked down at the floor. Others stared at me with sympathy. Daniel stepped forward. His jaw tightened. But before he could speak, I gently touched his arm. Not because my mother's words didn't hurt. Because I had spent years learning that reacting in anger often gives humiliation exactly what it wants, an audience. So I simply stood there, breathing, waiting, because somewhere deep inside me, I felt something unusual. Not hope. Not confidence. Only the strange certainty that this story had not reached its ending yet. And none of us, not even my mother, could have imagined who was about to walk through those church doors. The heavy silence stretched across the church. No one knew whether the ceremony would continue or collapse under the weight of what had just happened. The pastor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Carter, perhaps this isn't the right." "Oh, I won't be long," my mother interrupted with another polished smile. "I simply believe a marriage should begin with honesty." She turned toward Daniel. "You seem like a kind young man. Kind people deserve the truth." I watched his face carefully. There was anger in his eyes. Not the loud, explosive kind. The quiet kind. The kind that appears when someone you love has been wounded in front of people who should have protected them. He looked at me instead of my mother. "Emily," he said calmly, "is there anything here I don't know about you?" I smiled through the tears gathering in my eyes. "No." He nodded once. "Then I don't need to hear another word." His answer echoed through the sanctuary. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. My aunt slowly lowered her eyes. My younger cousin Lily quietly wiped away a tear. My father remained completely still. That wasn't unusual. Throughout my childhood, silence had been his way of surviving conflict. He wasn't cruel. He simply believed peace meant saying nothing. Unfortunately, silence often protects the loudest person in the room. My mother laughed lightly, as though Daniel's response amused her. "Young love is blind," she said. "One day you'll understand." She reached into her purse and unfolded a worn piece of paper. "I actually made a list years ago." A few people shifted uneasily in their seats. She adjusted her glasses. Age 16, quit the school debate team. Age 19, changed college majors. Age 23, left a corporate job. She looked up proudly. Patterns matter. Every sentence landed like another stone. What she didn't mention was why those things had happened. I left the debate team because I was working evenings to help pay household bills. I changed majors because my scholarship program had closed. I left my corporate job after receiving an offer to lead a non-profit project that helped hundreds of struggling families. Facts can tell the truth. Lists can hide it. My mother knew the difference. She always had. Daniel stepped closer to me. "If this ceremony has taught me anything," he said quietly, "it's that success and failure depend on who's telling the story." For the first time that morning, my mother's smile faltered. Only for a second. Then she recovered. "Believe whatever you wish." She folded the paper neatly. "I'm finished." The pastor took a slow breath. "Shall we continue?" I nodded. So would I. The music began again. I had barely taken 2 steps toward the altar when the massive wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open. Everyone turned. A man in a dark grey suit stood in the doorway. He looked to be in his early 60s. His silver hair was neatly combed. In one hand, he carried a weathered leather envelope sealed with dark blue wax. His eyes scanned the room carefully. When they found me, he asked in a calm but unmistakably clear voice, "Is Emily Carter here?" The church fell silent once again. I slowly raised my hand. "I'm Emily." The man nodded respectfully. "I've traveled over 800 miles to deliver something that was entrusted to me many years ago." He held up the envelope. "It was to be given to you only on your wedding day." A ripple of whispers spread through the pews. My mother frowned. "What is this?" she demanded. The stranger didn't even look at her. Instead, he walked slowly down the center aisle until he stood only a few feet away from me. He extended the envelope with both hands. "Miss Carter," he said, "before you open this, I need you to know something. I made a promise 20 years ago. And today, I'm finally able to keep it." I looked down at the seal. Stamped into the blue wax was a symbol I had never seen before. Beneath it, written in elegant handwriting, were just 7 words. For Emily when she finally knows her worth. My hands began to tremble. Behind me, I heard my mother whisper for the first time that day. "In what letter, Emily?" My mother's voice was barely louder than a whisper. For the first time since I could remember. It wasn't confident. It wasn't controlled. It carried something I had almost never heard from her. Uncertainty. I looked from the envelope to the stranger. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "Have we met before?" He smiled politely. "No. My name is Thomas Bennett. I was a friend of someone who cared about your future more than you may realize." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And I promised that I would not contact you until this exact day." The church had become so quiet that I could hear the old wooden beams creaking overhead. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. Everyone was waiting. Daniel gently rested his hand against the small of my back. "If you're ready," he whispered, "I'll stand here." I nodded. My fingers slid beneath the flap of the envelope. The paper inside was thick. Old. Carefully preserved. As I unfolded the first page, another object slipped onto the floor. A small silver key. It spun once across the polished wood before coming to rest near my shoes. Thomas bent down and picked it up. "Keep that safe. You'll understand its purpose after you've finished reading." I stared at him. "What is this?" He answered with the same calm expression. "The beginning of a truth that has waited 20 years. I looked back at the letter. The handwriting was elegant, steady, and unmistakably personal. The first line made my heart stop. "Dear Emily, if you are reading this, then the promise I made has finally reached its rightful day." My breathing became shallow. I continued. "You have probably spent most of your life believing you disappointed the people closest to you. I hope, before this day ends, you understand that disappointment and truth are rarely the same thing." Tears blurred the ink. I blinked several times before reading the next paragraph. "There were people who saw your kindness when others only counted your mistakes. There were people who quietly watched you choose integrity, even when nobody applauded you." A memory surfaced. I was 11 years old. Walking home from school. Giving half my lunch to an elderly woman who sat outside the grocery store every afternoon. When I got home, my mother had scolded me for being foolish. "You'll never get ahead if you keep giving things away." At the time, I believed she was teaching me responsibility. Now I wondered if she simply measured success differently. I turned another page. Thomas watched silently. Daniel never let go of my hand. My mother took one hesitant step forward. "What does it say?" Nobody answered her. The letter continued. "The world often rewards confidence before character. Do not mistake the applause of others for proof of worth. Character is quieter, but it lasts longer." The words felt strangely familiar. As though someone had understood parts of me that I had never managed to explain myself. Guests leaned forward. Nobody interrupted. Nobody whispered anymore. The church no longer felt like a wedding venue. It felt like a room where decades of assumptions were slowly beginning to crack. Then I reached the final paragraph on the first page. "There is another document inside this envelope. Read it only after you finish this letter. It contains facts that others chose never to tell you. They do not change who you are, but they may change how you understand your own story." I slowly lowered the page. Inside the envelope was another folded document. Much thicker. Official-looking. Stamped with faded seals. Before I could unfold it, Thomas spoke again. That document answered questions for me many years ago. He looked toward my mother for the first time. His expression remained respectful. But there was unmistakable sadness in his eyes. I suspect it will answer questions for others today as well. My mother's confident smile had completely disappeared. She looked at the envelope as though she already feared what it might contain. And for the first time in my life, I realized she wasn't afraid of what I might discover. She was afraid of what everyone else might discover about the story they had believed for so many years. I unfolded the second document with trembling hands. The paper was older than the letter. Its edges had yellowed with time, and an official seal was pressed into the bottom corner. I wasn't even halfway through the first paragraph before I stopped breathing. My eyes searched the page again, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. Emily, Daniel asked softly. I couldn't answer. Instead, I handed the document to him. He read the first few lines, then looked at me with complete disbelief. What is it? The pastor asked. Thomas spoke quietly. If Emily is comfortable, she should decide whether to share it. I looked around the church. Dozens of faces were waiting. Some were curious. Some were uncomfortable. Some were beginning to realize that my mother's speech had not been the end of the story. It had only been the beginning. I took a slow breath. My mother told everyone my whole life that I was irresponsible, that I wasted every opportunity I was given, and that everything I achieved came from someone else. My voice shook. This document says something very different. I lifted the paper. It says that when I was 8 years old, an anonymous educational trust was created in my name. A murmur spread across the room. The trust wasn't for money to spend freely. It was only for education, professional training, and starting a career based on service to others. I looked toward Thomas. He nodded. It also says, I continued, that every year the trustees reviewed my conduct, my academic work, and my character. I swallowed. If I had acted dishonestly, or used people for personal gain, the trust would have been dissolved. Daniel smiled faintly. So everything you earned. I earned by staying true to who I was, I finished. Thomas stepped forward. For 20 years, the trustees never had to issue a single warning. The room fell silent again. He continued. Miss Carter's record contains reports from teachers, employers, community leaders, and scholarship directors. He paused. They all described the same young woman. He looked directly at me. Reliable, compassionate, quietly determined. My eyes filled with tears. Those were words I had never once heard inside my own home. Not once. Across the aisle, my father lowered his head into his hands. It was as if every sentence peeled away another layer of the story our family had lived for decades. Then Thomas reached into his briefcase. There is one final item. He removed a thin folder tied with a blue ribbon. This contains copies of letters written over the last 20 years. Letters, I asked. Letters from people whose lives Emily changed. He untied the ribbon carefully. The trustees believed that if this day ever came, the people present should know the difference between reputation and reality. He opened the folder. The first letter is from your 5th grade teacher. He began reading. Emily stayed after school every Tuesday for an entire semester to help another student learn to read. She asked me never to tell anyone because she didn't want him to feel embarrassed. A woman in the 3rd row covered her mouse. Thomas turned the page. This letter is from the director of the homeless shelter where Emily volunteered during college. He read again. When donations were short, Emily quietly worked extra weekend shifts and purchased supplies with money she had earned herself. She refused public recognition every time. Another page. Another voice. Another forgotten act of kindness. None of them were dramatic. None of them had made the news. But together they revealed something far more powerful than a single grand gesture. They revealed a life. A life my mother had never described. Or perhaps had never truly seen. I looked toward her. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't smiling either. She simply stared at the letters as though they belonged to a stranger. In a way, they did. Because the daughter she had spent years calling, the family's biggest failure, was someone she had never taken the time to know. And for the first time, everyone else in that church could see the difference between the story that had been told and the truth that had quietly existed all along. My father slowly stood up. For a moment, I thought he was going to leave. Instead, he walked into the center aisle. His shoulders, which had always seemed so steady when I was a child, suddenly looked heavy. Older. He stopped a few feet in front of me. I need to say something. His voice cracked. It was the first time I had ever heard it do that. He turned toward the guests. When Emily was 12, she came home with the highest mathematics score in her school. And a few relatives looked surprised. I remember it because she ran through the front door holding the certificate. He closed his eyes for a second. Before I could congratulate her, my wife said, "One good grade doesn't make up for everything else." He swallowed hard. I said nothing. The church remained silent. I told myself I was keeping the peace. He looked directly at me. I wasn't. I was protecting my own comfort. And every time I stayed silent, Emily paid the price. I had imagined this moment in 100 different ways over the years. In none of them did my father apologize. Yet here he was. Not trying to erase the past. Not asking to be forgiven. Simply telling the truth. "I cannot change what happened," he continued. "But I can stop pretending I didn't see it." He stepped back. "I'm sorry, Emily." No dramatic music played. No one applauded. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter. More honest. Then my grandfather, who was 84 and rarely spoke during family gatherings anymore, slowly pushed himself to his feet with the help of his cane. "I've been waiting too long." Everyone turned toward him. He looked at my mother. "When your daughter was 15, you asked me why I always defended her." My mother didn't answer. He continued, "I told you something that day." His voice was steady despite his age. "I said, one day you'll mistake her silence for weakness, and it'll be the biggest mistake you ever make." He looked at me and smiled gently. "I wasn't talking about revenge. I was talking about character." He pointed toward the stack of letters Thomas had brought. "Character has a strange habit. It keeps growing, even when nobody is watching." The words settled over the room like sunlight after a storm. My mother remained motionless. Her hands, which had held the microphone so confidently only 20 minutes earlier, now trembled at her sides. Finally she spoke. I thought." Then she stopped. Perhaps for the first time in years, she didn't know how to finish a sentence. Thomas looked at her kindly. "Mrs. Carter." She raised her eyes. "Do you know what every report in these files has in common?" She shook her head. "Not one of them talks about Emily proving someone wrong. They all describe her helping someone else." He paused. "Your daughter spent 20 years building a life. Not a case against you." Those words seemed to reach every corner of the church. I felt Daniel squeeze my hand. "You ready?" he whispered. I looked around the sanctuary. At my friends. At my family. At the people who had witnessed the most painful moment of my life. And then watched it become something entirely different. I smiled through tears. "Yes." The pastor stepped forward with a warm expression. "I believe," he said softly, "we've all been reminded today that truth sometimes arrives later than we expect." He looked at Daniel and me. "If you're still willing." Daniel laughed quietly. "I've never been more willing." The guests smiled for the first time that morning. The music began again. This time no one interrupted. I walked down the aisle once more. Not because my past had disappeared, but because it no longer had the final word. And as I reached the altar beside the man who had loved me without demanding proof, I realized something my younger self had needed to hear years ago. Some people spend their lives trying to convince you that your worth depends on their opinion. The right people simply recognize your worth and invite you to become even more of who you already are. The ceremony finally began. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the family's biggest failure. I felt exactly who I had been all along. After the ceremony, the church slowly emptied. The joyful conversations that usually follow a wedding were quieter than anyone expected. Groups of relatives stood together, speaking in hushed voices. Not because they were gossiping, because they were rethinking years of assumptions. One by one, people approached us. My fifth-grade teacher, Mrs. Lawson, hugged me tightly. "I've wanted to tell you how proud I was for years," she said. "But every time I met your family, I felt as though my words disappeared before they reached you." One of my uncles looked embarrassed. "I owe you an apology," he admitted. "Whenever your mother described you, I believed her. I never asked what your side of the story was." I smiled gently. "You weren't the only ones." He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. Across the room, my mother stood alone. For the first time in any family gathering I could remember, no one had gathered around her. No one was angry with her. No one was arguing. People were simply quiet. Sometimes silence is not punishment. Sometimes it is reflection. Daniel leaned toward me. "You don't have to speak to her today." "I know. And if you do, it should be because you're ready, not because anyone expects it." I appreciated that. For so much of my life, people had expected me to manage everyone else's emotions. Today, I finally had permission to manage my own. Just as we were preparing to leave, Thomas approached me once more. "There is one last thing." He reached into his briefcase and handed me a small wooden box. It was beautifully carved, with the same symbol that had been pressed into the blue wax seal. "The key," he said. I smiled through my tears. "The silver key." He nodded. "It belongs to this." My hands trembled as I unlocked the tiny brass lock. Inside were several photographs, letters, a leather-bound journal, and one sealed envelope marked in elegant handwriting. "To be opened only after your wedding ceremony." I looked up. Thomas smiled. "That one is from the person who started the trust." "Who was it?" I asked. He took a slow breath. "Someone who believed that your greatest strength would never be your achievements." He paused. "They believed your greatest strength would be the way you treated people after being treated unfairly yourself." I carefully opened the final envelope. The first sentence brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Emily, if this letter reaches you, then you have already won. Not because others finally recognized your worth, but because you never allowed bitterness to become your identity." I continued reading. "Recognition is wonderful, but it is not the reward. The reward is becoming someone whose character remains intact, even when misunderstood." I closed my eyes. Those words settled into my heart more deeply than any compliment ever could. When I looked up again, my mother was walking slowly toward me. She stopped a few feet away. There were no cameras, no audience, no microphones, just the two of us. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me," she said quietly. "I don't know if I deserve it." I listened without interrupting. She wiped away a tear. "I spent years measuring success by trophies, titles, and comparisons." She looked at the letters in my hands. "I never noticed that you were becoming someone people trusted." Another long silence. "I thought I was pushing you to be stronger." She lowered her head. "I didn't realize I was teaching you that my love had to be earned." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I answered as honestly as I could. "I can't pretend today erased the past." She nodded. "I know. But I also don't want the future to look exactly like the past." A tear rolled down her cheek. Neither of us hugged. Neither of us made dramatic promises. Healing rarely begins with grand speeches. It begins with one truthful conversation. As Daniel and I walked out of the church into the afternoon sunlight, I looked back one final time. The building behind us had witnessed humiliation, truth, regret, and grace, all in the span of a single morning. Years later, people would ask me what changed my mother's mind. I always gave the same answer. It wasn't the letter. The letter simply revealed what had been true all along. People can misunderstand you for years. They can repeat stories that were never fair. They can underestimate your character because they only measure visible success. But truth has remarkable patience. It doesn't always arrive quickly. Sometimes it waits quietly until the right moment. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't need to shout. It simply stands in the light and lets everyone see what was there all along. Several months after the wedding, life became surprisingly ordinary. That may not sound like a happy ending, but for me it was. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up wondering how to prove my worth to someone else. Daniel and I settled into a small house about 30 minutes outside the city. It wasn't extravagant. The kitchen cabinets were older than we were, the backyard needed constant work. And the roof leaked during the first heavy rain. We laughed through all of it. One Saturday morning, while we were painting the living room, my phone rang. It was my father. Would it be all right if I came by? His voice still carried a hesitation I had never heard before. Of course. He arrived carrying a cardboard box. I found these in the attic. Inside were dozens of things I had forgotten existed. My elementary school drawings. Science fair ribbons. A notebook filled with short stories I had written when I was 13. Every page had been carefully preserved. I looked at him. You kept these? He nodded. I always meant to give them to you. What stopped you? He looked down. I convinced myself there would always be another time. That sentence stayed with me long after he left. There is always another time. Until there isn't. Over the following year, my relationship with my father slowly changed. Not because we erased the past. Because we finally started telling each other the truth about it. My mother changed more slowly. Some wounds don't heal on a schedule. Sometimes she would call simply to ask how I was doing. Other times she would catch herself beginning an old criticism. Then stop. Apologize. Start again. It wasn't perfect. Real change rarely is. One evening, nearly a year after the wedding, she asked if she could meet me for coffee. She arrived early. No makeup. No carefully rehearsed confidence. Just a woman who looked tired. I've been seeing a counselor, she said quietly. I hadn't expected that. She continued. I've spent months trying to understand why I always compared you to everyone else. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. My parents raised me that way. If someone else succeeded, it meant I wasn't enough. She gave a sad smile. I passed that fear on to you. I listened. Not because her explanation erased my pain, but because understanding and excusing are two different things. Before we left, she said something I never thought I would hear. I spent years trying to make you into the daughter I imagined. I never stopped to appreciate the daughter I already had. Those words didn't rewrite my childhood, but they helped write a different future. A few months later, Thomas invited Daniel and me to a gathering of the trustees who had quietly overseen the educational trust for so many years. There were 7 of them. Retired teachers, a former judge, a nurse, a librarian, an engineer. Ordinary people. None of them had sought recognition. One of them smiled and said, "We didn't invest in your success, Emily. We invested in your character." Another added, "Success changes with circumstances. Character usually doesn't." As we drove home that evening, Daniel reached across the center console and took my hand. "Do you realize something?" "What?" "The most important thing that happened on our wedding day wasn't that everyone learned who you really were." I looked at him. "It was that you finally stopped believing the story someone else wrote about you." He was right. That was the real miracle. Not the letter. Not the trust. Not even the public truths. The real turning point came the moment I no longer needed another person's approval to believe my own worth. If there is one lesson my life has taught me, it is this. Families can pass down love. They can also pass down fear, comparison, silence, and impossible expectations. Those patterns can continue for generations if nobody chooses to break them. Breaking them doesn't always require a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it begins with something much quieter. A truthful conversation. A healthy boundary. A kind decision. A refusal to believe that your value depends on another person's opinion. That is how systems change. Not all at once. One choice at a time. And every time I look at the framed wedding photograph hanging in our hallway, I notice something different from what everyone else sees. Most people see a bride and groom smiling at the altar. I see the day I stopped trying to earn the love I had always deserved. And that changed everything. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to overcome a label that someone in your own family placed on you? How did you move forward? Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.